Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about how, in the history of slavery, and slavery's been going on for easily between 5 and 7,000 years, so long before white people became involved in the slave trade or using slaves or getting slaves to work on plantations. So thousands of years before white people showed up, slavery was going on. Now, slavery it's been racialized and emotionalized and radicalized today. So we tend to forget that slavery was really an issue about solving labor shortages and even shortage of skills in some cases. If you wanted to build a big something like the pyramids or some major public works, the Parthenon in Athens or something like that, that took a lot of labor, certainly back in the day. So typically you'd be short on key skills like stonemasons and that sort of thing. So you'd go around trying to find people who could do that work. And the way it was done, back in the day, and I'm not suggesting it was right or wrong or anything, but the way it was for thousands of years was just simply to grab people, off the street and turn them into slaves, typically for a certain period of time. So it was always about labour and never about race. That's only something that's become racialised quite recently, and of course used for propaganda purposes. But what we're looking at is something unique today that I think, certainly by my estimation at least, for the first time ever in history, the slaves have failed to integrate with the slavers. So throughout history, whenever slaves were imported, they always ended up integrating with the local society. And a classic example of this is ancient Rome, where they grabbed a lot of Greek slaves. And these slaves, in the reign of Emperor Claudius, for example, the two key advisors to the emperor of the Roman Empire, so at the very apex of government, the two key advisors, Pallas and Callistus, were freed slaves. They had been slaves in Rome, and they had, at the end of their term or time limit, they become freedmen, as they called it in Rome, and they then became the key advisors to the emperor of the Roman Empire. So that they're at the very apex of government. They're very influential people, and prominent, powerful Roman citizens are coming around begging them for favors and to be able to have an audience with the emperor and so on. And so when the emperor was looking for a wife, it was these two people that looked at the available candidates and advised the emperor. So, and if we look at throughout Rome, Greek freed slaves were serving as tutors and teachers, philosophers, language interpreters, and as I mentioned, key advisors to the emperor, and also key advisors to some of the heavyweight senators of the time. So freed slaves were big players in the Roman political and cultural, and also other things like mathematicians and things like that. These were, there's a lot of Greeks involved in that. So freed slaves were integrating in with the Roman population. They were marrying Romans from prominent Roman families, and their children were going on to be senators and themselves, magistrates and key people in the Roman. So the slaves integrating. And again, if we look at slaves as a racial thing of ownership and oppression and drama and Black Lives Matter, then we see it through the wrong lens. That's not how it was. It was a labour issue, and these people were warmly accepted in society. Now, you don't have a slave class who are thought upon as low lifes or something like. You don't have them rising to the very apex of government in what was then the biggest, most prosperous empire on the planet, and that's what these freed slaves were. So we have throughout history a situation where the slaves, again, the workers that were brought in, without maybe their full agreement, were integrating with the local society without anyone sort of raising an eyebrow. There was no big deal. There wasn't a carry on in Rome about look at we're marrying. My daughter's marrying a former slave. It wasn't like that. These people were seen very much on merit. Same in ancient Athens. Slaves were being brought in from various places around the wider Greek world, but also some of the more Arabic peoples in North Africa and in what today would be modern day Turkey were brought in and could serve as apprentices to things like stonemasons and silversmiths and goldsmiths and that sort of thing. And so they in turn would inherit the business and themselves become prominent citizens and owners of very successful businesses in Athens and other parts of Greece. Not so much Sparta necessarily, but certainly other parts of Greece. So there's a long tradition over thousands of years where the slave population would integrate with, or largely integrate with the local. So the slave owner and the slaver, after a period of time, there's no difference between the two. They were the same. They were both citizens and business owners and politicians and magistrates and so on. So throughout history, that's pretty much how it worked. Now, even though the Romans and the Greeks were in close enough proximity to Africa to access vast numbers of black slaves if they wanted, they chose not to. For some reason at the time, they much preferred white slaves. Or at least they didn't want black slaves, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. But given the preference, they could have picked up black slaves more cheaply to do all sorts of work around the place. Especially on big farms or on big projects like building the pyramids or something like that. The Egyptians had access to vast numbers of black slaves if they wanted them, but they chose not to. They chose primarily other Arabs or indeed people like Greeks and so on. But they didn't choose to bring in vast numbers of blacks to do this work when that was the easiest, most accessible big labour supply, but they still didn't do it. They still preferred other Arabs or Arabic, the wider Arabic sort of diaspora. They preferred Arabic workers. So coming back to the idea that there was a lot of integration and pretty much complete integration. If you look at say England and Britain as an example, Britain was frequently invaded. The Romans came, and then the Saxons, followed by the Angles and Jutes and the Danes, and the Vikings, and all that sort of thing. So there were constant invasions there, and typically they would more or less enslave the local populace when they turned up. They're warrior class that they say, okay, well, you guys till the fields and do the work for us, and we'll give you protection. It was a bit of a protection racket, I guess, in a way. But it didn't take long for the languages to change, a new language to be formed. The different races would integrate. They would intermarry. Important jobs would be given to what would have ostensibly been the slave class. So in the end, they were almost indistinguishable, so up to a certain level at least. The Norman French elite that came in 1066 kept their position at the apex of society, or at least in the majority there for quite a few centuries. But to all other intents and purposes, they instead of converting the locals, they ended up speaking the local language and adopting local customs, changing laws to meet the local situation, and so on and so forth. So there was a great deal of integration, even if there still was elitism, but there still was integration, and people that weren't part of the Norman French elite could still rise to high office and take important jobs and positions, in the clergy or in the administration, and in other areas of business and so on. So what we're looking at today in for example, the United States, is where this is, I believe, the first time in history where the slave class not only doesn't want to integrate, but actually is hanging on grimly to the attitudes and behaviours of the Stone Age society that they came from when they were brought as slaves. And I keep on repeating this, that if slaves going to the Caribbean and the United States, black slaves, from Africa, if there'd been any other option for finding a labour source, they would have taken it. The blacks were the only labour source that could, well, A, there was many of them, B, they were easily available because blacks were enslaving each other and happily selling it to the Arabs and the white folks in the ports. But if there had been any other labour source, they would have taken it. The blacks were the only ones that A, were available, but B and C could withstand all the diseases that were very hardy when it came to withstanding diseases, and were capable of doing some of the bulk heavy work. So those are the things. But if there'd been another labour source, a white labour source, particularly given the diseases, and they would have taken it, or the local Indians, they were already there. It was far more preferable to use them if that was practical. But they were particularly vulnerable to diseases, and also seemed to they'd rather die than do any work, and that sort of thing. So that was it. Just made it impossible for any other labour source to be used at that time for that sort of work in those sort of conditions. But if there had been another one, they would have used it. So we're looking at probably the first time in history there hasn't been an integration between what hitherto were the slave owner class and the slave class, and this is something that's quite unique. I guess there are a few sort of things here to consider. Most of the blacks in Africa, even though they'd been in close enough proximity to the much more advanced Arabic and white peoples, and had interacted with them, even though they'd been there, they still really hadn't moved much past the Stone Age. In many areas were still in the Stone Age. Even the coastal areas that had regular interaction with white people and who'd seen things made from iron and so on, they still hadn't really gone beyond this. There are plenty of places in Africa still didn't have the wheel, for example. I mean, that seems astonishing, even in the 16 and 1700s. So we're looking at for some reason a race of people that were almost grimly hanging on to the Stone Age. Even the Zulus, and the Zulus were happy to enslave other blacks. In fact, that was part of their shtick. And as a warrior class, they were quite effective. Even if you look at their weaponry, they were still making spearheads out of very, very crude iron that wasn't smelted to any great degree. Even the Arabs at 600 BC still had more advanced metallurgy techniques than the Zulus did in the 1800s. That'll give you an idea. So a span of nearly 2,500 years, and the blacks still haven't caught up with the technology of the Arab, in this case, technology or white technology from 2,500 years previous. That's the chasm, technological chasm that separated them. So even though the technology of the white and the Arab people, even though they were exposed to it, they still hadn't changed. Whereas you look at the Europeans, any new technological development was seized upon, and it went across the continent in a matter of a few years. whereas even thousands of years for the black Africans, that they hadn't changed. And even today, you still see a situation where you seem to be looking at a people that are stuck in some time warp from thousands of years ago. And even in the United States, where again the blacks have been, shoulder to shoulder with white folks for hundreds of years and many generations, sometimes more than 10, 12 generations, even longer than that. And yet still their social, amongst themselves, their social structure and attitudes of most, I mean, there's outliers, I'm talking generally here, there's always going to be outliers. They still have many of the same views and attitudes that they had if they were still living in an African village. Now, if you look at any country that's run by blacks, regardless of how rich it is in resources and so on, it's always dirt poor and basket case and corrupt and tribalism and factionalism. It makes even the most dysfunctional Western society look like some sort of social paradise. But they are unable to create wealth or unable to act in any sort of common good, and corruption seems to be just the way things are. Even today, slavery occurs in parts of Africa, which seems incredible and a bit rich that all this is heaped on white people when in reality it's still going today. Blacks enslaving each other, or Arabs enslaving blacks. So this is the thing. So if we even look at the Spartan helots, that were a slave class, and it's in the thumbnail or a little image from that, they were it was a warrior class dominating effectively their own people, but or mostly their own people, but dominating them as they were just to work the farms and supply the food and so on, while the warrior elite ran things and so on. But even then, once that warrior caste thing fell to pieces, or started to fall to pieces after, say, 350 BC, around there, you see they all started to integrate as well, and then became indistinguishable from one another over time. But the crossover of interracial and integration with blacks and whites, for example, in the United States, the integration has been quite. I mean, some people say it's between 2% and 5%. I don't know. Every number you look at seems to be different, but we'll assume 5% as a maximum, integrating there into marriage, that sort of thing. Then the future, it certainly doesn't look particularly good for that sort of integration to take place. So we're probably looking at the first time in history ever where the slave class and the slaver class have not integrated, or barely integrated in any way. And I would think in another 100 years, the situation might be vastly different. Now, I don't think that's due to as the propagandists claim, it's racism, it's this, it's that. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. We're looking at a group of people who haven't really wanted to integrate, that they would rather hang around in those groups and want to behave in a way that would make them, very unattractive partners for white people, whereas in the ancient world, Rome and Greece and so on, the difference between the slaver and the slaver was actually pretty minimal, given it was a labour force issue. So as it was by the way of the blacks, but there was cultural, and there's very few differences between them, and they integrated seamlessly over time. So we're looking at something new here, or certainly both unforeseen and unknown territory, and the policies and attitudes that are and prescriptions that are needed by the Western countries that are importing a lot of black people, and of course the residue of the slavery days in the United States. These prescriptions need to be far more imaginative than they currently are. It's nothing to do with white racism. It's absolute utter crap. But what we do need is to have a good and substantial debate over it, to see where things can be improved and where integration, if indeed it's even possible, one would hope it is, how that can take place. That's my take on things. You've been with Tacitus today on your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.